Who was responsible for the greatest scam in human history? You might say it was Bernie Madoff, or Elizabeth Holmes, or Enron, but I think it's a man you've probably never heard of. He was the Prince of Poyais, a beautiful country on the coast of Central America. It was different than other countries in the area. Its climate was better, there were no mosquitoes or tropical diseases. Its land was fertile, its economy was booming. As a matter of fact, European settlers flocked there by the hundreds. There was just one problem. Poyais didn't exist. Bernie Madoff faked an investment. Elizabeth Holmes faked an invention. But Gregor MacGregor faked an entire country. And the whole world believed him. This is the story of the greatest con man in human history. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Who was Gregor MacGregor? The greatest con man in history came from surprisingly unremarkable beginnings. He was born in Scotland in 1786. His family wasn't particularly wealthy, but they also weren't poor. And the best option for men from families like this was often joining the military. So, MacGregor joined the British Army at 16 years old. His mother bought him a commission as an officer, which surprisingly was completely normal back then. As a matter of fact, you could buy your way into being an officer in the British Army until 1871. MacGregor started off with a few unremarkable but solid years of service in the military, but then he gets into a big argument with one of his senior officers, and he left the army. Well, he left the army in the sense that Richard Nixon left the presidency.
Well, I'm not a crook.
So MacGregor moves back in with his mom in Edinburgh, and it's here at age 24 that we see the first signs of the con man he will become later in life. Gregor MacGregor's scams start out small and mostly harmless. He begins to pretend that he's descended from Scottish royalty and starts calling himself Sir Gregor MacGregor. And it's at this time that he also has a bizarre stroke of luck. The battalion that he had served in before quitting the army suddenly becomes very famous. They fight in a battle that is so famous it creates a new English word. Die Hard, as in he's a Die Hard fan, or the movie with Bruce Willis. The phrase comes from a wounded officer who refused to leave the field and yelled, "Die hard, men, die hard!" But while his old battalion was dying hard, MacGregor was drinking wine in his mom's house in Edinburgh. He had already left the army at that point. But MacGregor never let little details like the truth get in the way of a good story. And so Sir Gregor MacGregor also became a war hero without firing a single shot. But he was a broke military hero until one day inspiration arrived in London. Inspiration's name was Francisco de Miranda. He was a Latin American revolutionary, and when he arrived in London, high society fell in love with him. He even became a little bit of a celebrity. MacGregor saw him and got jealous. He wanted a little bit of celebrity. So MacGregor uses his reputation as a war hero, big air quotes, to get a position as an officer in the Venezuelan Revolutionary Army. Venezuela had just declared its independence from Spain, and there were plenty of opportunities for young men seeking fame and fortune. So MacGregor set sail across the Atlantic and started a new life in 1812. Even though he lied his way into the job, MacGregor actually is a decent officer at first. He's able to suppress his con man instincts a little bit. He even has one legitimate military success, a miraculous 34-day retreat across Venezuela that ends up being critical to defeating the Spanish. But after this success, things take a turn for the bizarre. MacGregor decides to raise funds and troops to invade Florida, which at the time was still a Spanish colony. He gets a ragtag crew together and they take over Amelia Island, a teeny little island off the coast of northern Florida. This could have been the first victory in a larger campaign, but instead, MacGregor decides to sit around all day long and get drunk on Amelia Island, which, to be fair, is a very Florida thing to do. He's promised his troops large wages, but instead of paying them in gold or silver, he prints worthless Amelia dollars. The troops are obviously not happy about that. And then, many days and many bottles of rum later, MacGregor just decides to abandon his troops. He sails off into the sunset with an angry crowd of soldiers yelling at him. Now, if I had a nickel for every time MacGregor abandoned his troops, I'd have 3 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened 3 times. Here is where the con man starts to show his true colors. MacGregor cooks up a ridiculous scheme to recruit British soldiers. He offers them huge financial incentives to come to South America. As you'll see, MacGregor has the tendency to promise the world to everyone and give it to no one. Everyone around him somehow always ends up empty-handed. He succeeded in recruiting 600 British troops, and together they attacked the port city of Portobello. And then something strange happens. A very similar scene repeats as what just happened on Amelia Island. The troops are successful in conquering the city, and then MacGregor lays around and gets drunk for days. Again. It's bizarre. He designs crests and medals and awards. You know, he loves a bit of camp. I think he liked uniforms and the trappings of military life much more than the actual fighting or commanding. He didn't even order anyone to patrol for the Spanish. And so when they counterattack, he's caught completely off guard. He has to jump out of his bedroom window and swim to a ship offshore. From there, he issues the command, "Do not surrender," to his troops, and then he promptly sails away and abandons them. This time things end tragically because the Spanish capture 200 troops and at least 11 are killed. And MacGregor is such a scoundrel, he even steals and sells one of his officers' boats. You would think this would be the end of his military career, but somehow he gets another 800 troops together and conquers another Latin American city. And it's the same old story. He gets drunk, the Spanish counterattack, and MacGregor, for the third time, abandons his troops. He was just such a piece of And finally, it caught up to him. He was kicked out of the army, kicked out of South America, and Simón Bolívar said if he ever stepped foot in South America again, he would have him hanged. And then, Gregor MacGregor disappeared. This is one of the strangest parts of this story. For 6 months, historians to this day have no idea where Gregor MacGregor was. But we know one thing. When he next emerges, he has cooked up the greatest scam in human history. So, how do you invent a country? How do you convince the whole world it exists? And most importantly, how do you make money off of it? Step 1. Buy cheap land. In 1820, MacGregor reappeared on the Mosquito Coast, an area in modern-day Honduras and Nicaragua. He purchased 8 million acres of mostly unusable land by trading a local tribal king some rum and jewelry. Step 2. Build credibility. Effective scams often take advantage of our psychology, particularly cognitive biases. For example, the authority bias is where we are much more likely to trust information that comes from someone of higher social standing or an expert, even if they have nothing to do with the topic at hand. The problem is, it is very easy for us to confuse the trappings of authority with real authority. This is where MacGregor's genius, if you want to call it that, really begins to shine. He sails back to London in 1821 and begins to introduce himself as the Prince of Poyais. Cazique is the exact title he uses. He was welcomed as a celebrity because he was now an exotic war hero and a head of state. The mayor of the city of London even invited him for lunch. But he doesn't stop there. MacGregor created an entire world. The guy's imagination and attention to detail was incredible. In another life, he could have written Dune or Lord of the Rings, but instead, he created Poyais. It must have taken him thousands of hours to create this impression of legitimacy. He created a coat of arms. He designed a flag. He describes complex governmental systems. He makes different military uniforms for each regiment. He invents crazy banking structures. But his masterpiece was a 355-page guidebook of Poyais, published under a fake name. Ironically, on the first page, the book says, "The author has endeavored as much as possible to avoid any statement which might appear doubtful or exaggerated." And then, of course, the book describes a paradise where the rivers literally have gold in them, and the soil yields twice as many crops as usual, and Europeans live to a very old age. There are no bugs, no diseases, the climate is so healthy, it's a spa destination. The capital city of Poyais has 20,000 people, a theater, an opera house. Oh, and the indigenous population? They love British people. And so people thought it must be real. The book has maps and sketches and instructions for growing crops and plant identification. How could there be so much info if it wasn't real? So he was able to move on to the next step, which sounds like the end, but it was just the beginning. Step 3, sell land in Poyais. MacGregor targeted his fellow Scotsmen. This is known as an affinity scam, where you target people like yourself, and they think, oh well, he wouldn't betray me, he's one of us. Many people poured their entire life savings into buying land in Poyais. Some wanted to retire there. Others were young people who wanted to get rich. A serious conman looks for two things in their targets: greed and gullibility. MacGregor plays on both. Just look at this sentence from the guidebook. With just £150, you could make 1,886! 2 exclamation points, which feels so modern somehow. You know, some things just never change. MacGregor would have made a killing selling crypto. At least 500 people bought land from MacGregor, and if he had just stopped at this point, we would not still be talking about it today. It would be just another small-scale con of the 1800s. But MacGregor's ambitions were much, much bigger. And here is where things get crazy. Step 4. Issue Poyais government bonds. To do this, MacGregor needs to convince more than some desperate Scottish peasants. He needs to convince the London Stock Exchange and some of the largest banks in the world that Poyais is real and a profitable investment. A flag, a guidebook, and some fancy military uniforms just weren't gonna cut it. So how do you get institutional buy-in to issue hundreds of millions of pounds of bonds? You have to do something so extreme, it would make it unfathomable that Poyais wasn't real. This is where the story gets dark, bizarre, and tragic. Step 5. Send real settlers to a fake country. Hundreds of settlers stand on the docks of London, cheering for a ship flying the Poyais flag. Gregor MacGregor walks through the crowds, shaking hands with the excited people. They are about to head to the land of their dreams. Gregor MacGregor kindly exchanges their gold and silver for his Bank of Poyais dollars. They'll be easier to spend when they get there, he promises them. The atmosphere is electric. The hopeful crowd boards the ship and begins the long journey across the Atlantic to start their new lives. Little do they know that many of them are headed to their deaths. After several weeks at sea, they arrive at what their maps said should have been Poyais. But the shoreline is nothing but jungle. Confusion begins to spread among the settlers. Where are the docks of Poyais? Where is the capital city? Surprisingly, no one suspects they've been scammed. They actually blame the captain at first, thinking that he's gotten them lost. Some even think he's purposefully keeping them away from Poyais and he is the scammer. In fact, the captain is as bought in as they are. MacGregor has promised him a huge estate outside of Poyais. But people don't actually worry that much at first. They just wait for the people of Poyais to make contact with them. Disease and hunger set in. A second ship full of settlers arrives, and they too are soon starving on the beach. All in all, 180 settlers died looking for Poyais, including women and children. MacGregor was always a liar, but now he had blood on his hands. In 1823, The Times, a prominent London newspaper, publishes a bombshell article alleging that Poyais does not exist. Other publications soon follow suit. There were plenty of eyewitnesses, and you would think this would be the end of MacGregor's scam. People went, there was no Poyais, and people died. But you should never underestimate Gregor MacGregor's ability to con his way out of any situation. Step 6. Muddy the waters. MacGregor starts a marketing blitz that makes Don Draper look like Donald Duck. He tells the press he is the real victim, a victim of an elaborate conspiracy orchestrated by a competing colony, British Honduras. Supposedly, they were in cahoots with the captain to prevent people from reaching Poyais in order to stunt its economic growth. Shockingly, there were even a few settlers who signed and published letters supporting MacGregor, including a man who had lost 2 of his children on the beaches of Poyais. Now, it's possible they were paid to say this, but we have no evidence of that. And so it's also possible that they had just drank the Kool-Aid so thoroughly they couldn't accept that they had been scammed. Shockingly, MacGregor's marketing campaign actually works. He is able to muddy the waters enough. He faces no legal consequences in London. But he still decides to head to Paris just to let things blow over for a little bit. Step 7. rinse, and repeat. It's kinda hard to believe, but after going through all of that, in Paris, MacGregor restarts the Poyais scheme. He even tries to send another batch of settlers there. It is so crazy. This man has no conscience whatsoever. Fortunately, this time, the French government noticed a bunch of people applying for passports to visit a place that they didn't recognize, and they stopped the expedition. MacGregor was arrested in France, but he writes a 5,000-word statement for the court that somehow gets him a not guilty verdict. The greatest irony of this story is that the thing that ends up hurting his scam the most is not bad press or the justice system or the dead bodies piling up. It is, quite simply, capitalism. You see, one of the main reasons why MacGregor made so much money selling Poyais bonds was because there was like a boom more broadly in Latin American bond speculation. And a lot of these countries had just gained independence, so it wasn't crazy to think about new countries popping up in Latin America. But in 1825, this market crashed. Some call it the first international financial crisis that wasn't caused by a war. And it may have been caused, at least partially, by the Poyais scheme. A few years after the crisis of 1825, pamphlets circulated in the city of London telling people not to buy Poyais bonds. But not because the country was fake, just because it was a bad investment. Even with it staring them right in the face, people still didn't realize Poyais was imaginary. MacGregor was able to run the Poyais scheme in various forms for another 13 years. Year by year, his scams got smaller and less profitable until in 1837, he tried to sell some land and no one would buy it. Step 8. Get away with it. Here is the part of the story where we want MacGregor to die poor and destitute, to somehow suffer for all of the wrong that he has done. But history isn't Hollywood. Sometimes bad people just get away with it. In 1837, after MacGregor's wife dies, who was Simón Bolívar's cousin, by the way, the story is just so crazy, he decides to move back to Venezuela. He somehow convinces the Venezuelan government to reinstate him as a general and pay him a pension. And despite all of MacGregor's sins, he lives happily ever after. He retires to a stately home in Caracas and spends the rest of his days drinking wine and socializing. When he died, he was buried with full military honors. The president of Venezuela even attended his funeral. Local obituaries described him as a valiant champion of independence. In reality, MacGregor was a liar. He destroyed the lives of thousands. But no one can deny that he was one of the greatest con men to have ever lived. MacGregor was able to muddy the water so much that even today, 200 years later, when you Google Poyais, the first question that pops up is Poyais real?